Hi everyone, we're really honored and privileged to have a great ecologist with us today, Professor Abi Tamim. He's a senior fellow and convener of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at ATRI. He's also a fellow of the DBT Wellcome Trust Clinical and Public Health Program. His research areas include animal movement ecology, disease ecology, OneHealth, savanna ecosystems, invasive species, and wildlife in human-dominated systems. Much of his research focuses on the outcome of interactions between species at the interface of humans, domestic animals, and wildlife in semi-arid savannas and agro-ecosystems. He also studies dynamics of rabies transmissions in multi-host systems and the role of small and medium animals in the transmission dynamics of Kyasanur forest disease. He has a master's in wildlife biology from WII and a PhD in wildlife science from University of Missouri. So just to give you a larger context, he has done amazing work in various subdisciplines of ecology. The biology department used one of his papers in the entrance exams for the PhD admissions this year. And we teach his class in many of our courses. And so we're really privileged to have him here with us, actually talk about his recent work. And the way we're going to structure it is that he's going to talk for 45 minutes. If you have any questions, do type it into the chat box and I'll call on you one by one after the talk is over and he can address your questions. So with that, over to you, Abhi, for the talk.
Thanks, Meghna. And so today's talk, I'm going to be focusing a little bit about an emerging topic, something that we're all really interested in, and that's really creating a lot of buzz across the world. But before I do that, I'll quickly introduce to you, because not many people would know the institution that I work for. Some of you do know it well, but most of you may not. So I work for an institution called the Ashoka Trust for research in ecology and the environment. It's based in Bangalore. ATRI's mission is to generate knowledge to inform and sustainability. So ATRI is in many senses a unique organization because it tries to and fairly successfully for the last almost 25 years, guys across three domains of being a think tank, an academic institution, as well as a grassroots NGO. Okay, so that's and one of the strengths of ATRI has been its broad interdisciplinarity. So the faculty at ATRI come from various disciplines, and therefore it allows us to actually merge the fields of ecology, sociology, anthropology, history, economics, etc. And increasingly with the work that I'm doing, also interface with public health to ask questions that are most pertinent and that are complex. One of the most complex things that we have to deal with currently is this huge shadow that's hanging over our heads, that of COVID-19. But COVID-19 is obviously not the first pandemic the world has seen. If you look at this advertisement or this public safety announcement, it says wear a mask, stamp out Spanish influenza. Now this is from 1930s. I mean, even then they were telling people to wear a mask. And clearly people haven't learned their lessons very well. Okay. So a consequence of all of this has seen the world grinding to an absolute halt. Okay. Iconic places in the world, the biggest cities have had their streets emptied out. Supermarket shelves have had all their toilet paper removed. And in India, we went through massive lockdowns that disrupted lives, disrupted livelihoods, and resulted in the exodus, or one of the largest forced migrations of people in modern history. Millions of people walking back to their homes, and the after effects of all of that can still be seen. India is amongst the leading, has amongst the highest number of cases of coronavirus infections worldwide. Okay, but the thing to note is that this pandemic was actually predicted fairly accurately, and this was not recently predicted. Here is a paper from 2007, okay, and I have highlighted a section of that paper, and I'll read it out to you. It says coronaviruses are well known to undergo genetic recombination, which may lead to new genotypes and outbreaks. The presence of a large reservoir of SARS-CoV-like viruses in horseshoe bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, is a time bomb. The possibility of the re-emergence of SARS and other novel viruses from animals or laboratories, and therefore the need for preparedness should not be ignored. Okay, so this is really prescient. This is not the only study. There have been various other studies that have warned of similar kinds of pandemic-like situations arising, and they've been very specific about their predictions as well. They said there have been several projects that have warned of this, and they've said that it most likely will be a coronavirus like SARS-CoV-2, like SARS-CoV, and that it may most likely emerge in South or Southeast Asia. Okay, but why do we know all this? Well, there's a science behind it, of course, and let's talk about it a little bit. So there's a whole field of study called that looks at emerging zoonotic viruses. Now, what are zoonotic viruses? They're basically viruses or pathogens that circulate in animal hosts. Okay, so the reservoir host, or the primary host for these species, is an animal, and those pathogens then may also transmit to humans. Okay, and we know of several of these, and I'll give you a couple of these examples. That transmission can happen either directly from the animal, say through contact with bodily fluids, or blood, such as blood, saliva, or via an intermediate animal host, such as a domestic animal, which can act as an amplifying host for this pathogen, or it can happen via a vector, such as a tick, a mosquito, or a flea. Okay, and most of the major illnesses known to humans are zoonoses, or that means that they're of zoonotic origin. For example, HIV and the AIDS pandemic is known to be of zoonotic origin. Many of these viruses or these pathogens can keep emerging and re-emerging from the environment. Okay, some of them then get their transmission dynamics delinked from the animal host that they originally came out from. Okay, an excellent example, of course, is COVID-19. COVID-19 no longer needs an animal reservoir. HIV no longer needs an animal reservoir. But there are various other species, other kinds of pathogens or viruses that still have animal reservoir hosts, and the infection to humans occurs as a spillover, as a regular spillover. Okay, and the risks of those spillover or those emergence or re-emergent events are linked to various kinds of human activities. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit. It can be things like encroachment into wildlife habitats. It can be deforestation, the destruction of biodiversity, hunting of native species, rapid urbanization, industrialized production of livestock, for instance. So all of these factors increase the risk of a pathogen emerging into humans. But what makes it go viral? Okay, in the true sense of the word, what converts it from being a local epidemic or an outbreak into a global problem? Well, that's our globalized lifestyle. Okay, it's the connectivity across the world we are able to now travel rapidly in under a day from one part of the world to another and circulate these viruses, which is exactly what happened with COVID-19. Okay. So now if you look at a map of the risk of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, and this is an analysis that was carried out in 2012 um, by scientists who you will see that. So what they did was they analyzed various risk factors that can lead to the risk of emergence of these diseases. And they found that if you overlay areas of high biodiversity, high human population density, and also livestock density, then that gives you the right conditions for um, for the emergence or for the risk of emergence of these pathogens. And as you can see from this bottom map right here, is that India, parts of Southeast Asia, South China, parts of the tropical areas of Central Africa, and a few parts of South America, but mostly parts in most of the old world tropics are really amongst the hottest of hotspots for the risk of emergence of these pathogens. So let's take you to a couple of examples of what kind of pathogens we're talking about. One is in fact one of the oldest known zoonoses, and one that's of particular interest to the work that I do and the work that's done by my group. Now, if you look at the global burden of dog-transmitted rabies and the distribution of human rabies deaths, you see a very similar pattern as that observed in the previous map that I showed you. Okay, so countries in Asia and Central or Tropical Asia and Tropical Africa have the highest human mortality or human rabies burdens in the world. India has the dubious distinction of having the highest number of cases in the world at approximately an estimated 20,000 deaths, human deaths per year. This accounts for more than 30% of the world's rabies burden. More than 95% of this comes from dogs, domestic dogs, of which, and bites, so dog bites, of which we suffer more than 20 million dog bite cases every year. Some of this data is fairly old and it is being updated, but the figures are unlikely to change too much. Hopefully the number of human rabies cases have reduced, but rabies is not a notifiable disease. So these still remain estimates. And most researchers believe that this is an underestimate. Okay. Now, rabies itself is a fascinating disease, and it has led historically. It is very well studied, and it has also led to some fantastic claims made about it. One, for example, is this spoof that was done. Basically, rabies caused a zombie apocalypse. And a lot of the zombie movies that you see out there are actually modeled after rabies outbreaks, or supposed this is how people would behave if they had rabies. But in reality, the clinical spectrum of rabies can be quite wide and quite horrible to look at. For example, patients in late stage rabies may need to be confined because of various kinds of symptoms that they may exhibit, including violence and an uncontrollable. Basically, their nervous system is breaking down, and in the last stages, they can suffer from encephalitis, coma, seizures, ultimately resulting in death. Now, the reason rabies is so feared is that because once you contract the disease, there is no cure. And more than 99% or almost 100% of cases have resulted in death of the patient. There are very few cases, you can barely count them, that have resulted in the recovery of a patient, and all too often, and even those who have recovered suffer from neurological deficiencies. Okay, so let's the history of rabies is also the history of the study of rabies is interesting. It uh, from a Western perspective, it comes from the Greek "lyssa," which means blood, which comes from blood, which is violent. Lyssa is the name of the rabies virus group, the Lyssa viruses. From the Latin rabies, again, uh, you get the sentiment, right? That is from rage, madness, fury. But some scholars have also said that might come from Sanskrit, rabhasa, to do violence. And indeed, the first written, or amongst the first written descriptions, very accurate written descriptions of rabies comes from the Shushuta Samhita, which was claimed to have been written somewhere between 1750 to 500 BC. And this is the description written there, the translation, of course. If the patient becomes exceedingly frightened at the sight or mention of the very name of water, he should be understood to have been afflicted with jalatrasa and be deemed to have been doomed. So this is hydrophobia that they are describing here. Of course, it does go on to give out various treatments for rabies, all of which, of course, were completely useless. For example, the paste of tila mixed with sesame along with shweta, punarnava, borhavia should be administered. These drugs are said to destroy the poison of rabid dogs. Now, the treatment of rabies, of course, was had a really important historic milestone uh, for the development of vaccines. And the world is now again actively waiting for a vaccine for COVID-19. But rabies was one of the first vaccines developed by Louis Pasteur. And it's a fascinating story to read about how he went about, the detail and the method he employed to develop this vaccine. Once Pasteur's vaccine was developed, it was deployed quite widely. For example, in pre-independent India, several Pasteur institutes were set up across the country to administer this vaccine to mostly British troops, but also then to the general public, because the British garrisons, it was a serious and significant health concern for them. For various reasons, the British, of course, were very fond of their dogs. So they were very concerned about the health of their dogs. And of course, the outbreak of rabies within the British garrisons was of great concern. It was also a great concern to them that British officers returning to Britain potentially took back rabid dogs, because those dogs had not yet shown symptoms of rabies or may not have exhibited full-blown rabies, and therefore impeded efforts to control rabies in Britain itself. Okay, so the control of rabies was a really important activity for the colonial regime in pre-independence India. And India was at that time at the forefront of development of new biologicals under the then head of the Pasteur Institutes. So that, for example, the Pasteur Institute in Kasauli was a really important Pasteur Institute. And by the time independence came about, the treatment of rabies was no longer such a problem, because they had managed to control it through these vaccination programs. And so slowly it stopped being a matter of public health concern, and it started falling by the wayside uh, in, uh, in public health priorities, both for the colonial government as well as for independent India. Uh, it is to such a bad state currently that is not even a notifiable disease, even though it ranks fairly high in all the zoonosis prioritizations that have been done. One of my PhD students, who's currently at Imperial College, Sri Radhakrishnan, has done a fascinating review of the history of rabies, and that will be shortly published. So if anyone is interested, I'll share that paper with you. So let's talk about rabies itself now. Okay, and trigger warning. There's going to be some videos that may be videos of animals that does show some suffering. So I'm just warning in advance. Okay, but whenever you think of rabies, or if you go and Google rabies or a rabid dog, most likely you will get an image that looks something like this. Okay, or if you imagine a rabid dog, you will find an image, or you would think of an animal growling, barking, being ferocious, baring its teeth. But actually, this image on the left is probably not even of a rabid dog. It's probably just of an aggressive dog. And maybe on the right also may not be of a rabid dog, even though you see some foaming of saliva. A lot of dogs also foam when they get hyperexcited. Okay, but let's take a few videos of rabid dogs, and then I'll let you guess which ones of those are, or let's make sure clinical symptoms of rabies or not. So here's one. Okay. This is what you would typically expect. Very aggressive, biting at anything that is put in front of it. And for example, you see it biting the bars now, very agitated. Okay, and then having this deep throaty sound. Okay, so that's what you typically expect to see from a rabid dog. This puppy surely can't be rabid. I mean, it's behaving completely normally. Look at it; it's just playing. Okay, and if you happen to see this pup on the road, you might be very well tempted to go and pet it, right? This video is of clearly a very sick dog, but it could be suffering from some other disease like canine distemper virus, for instance, or just be starving. And it's clearly in very, very poor condition. This animal, you can tell that there's potentially something wrong with it. It's very disoriented. It's walking around. It's trying to go towards the water source. So it doesn't seem to even show hydrophobia in that sense. Okay, and other than disorientation, it seems to be behaving normally. It's not aggressive at all. Okay. Here's a Labrador, somebody's pet dog, clearly. But you can see that its tongue is hanging out in this manner, and there seems to be something off with it. And in fact, it's got lockjaw. It's probably not been able to close its tongue for several days, and that's why you see it so dirty. So all of these dogs that I've shown you are actually positive for rabies. Okay. So they're all rabid, and they all died very soon after these videos were taken of them. So what we think of a general manifestation of rabies on the streets is not typically what you would see. Very few dogs show that hyper-aggressive form that we normally associate with rabies. Okay, the symptoms can vary greatly, and therefore it's often difficult. Unless you're a very trained and experienced veterinarian to be able to use clinical symptoms to diagnose a rabid dog. And therefore, often we have to rely on tests. Now, the world itself has, given
no video.
Yeah, I know. I'm moving on to the next slide. So the world has come together to defeat this scourge. I mean, this is a really old disease. We've known about it for hundreds of years. And because there's no cure for rabies, people are really, really afraid of rabies itself. And therefore, they want to come to the world has decided to come together. The World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the OIE, and various other institutions have come together to try to rid the world of rabies, because rabies is actually very easily preventable. There's a very excellent and effective vaccine, that can prevent rabies from happening both in humans as well as in dogs and other animals. Okay. Now, rabies is also a poster child for what's called One Health. Okay. Now, One Health is a concept that was pioneered in the early 2000s, and it basically recognizes that human health is intricately linked with animal health and environmental health. And the One Health model or the One Health framework simply says that that a collaborative, multi-sectoral, and transdisciplinary approach working at multiple levels can achieve optimal health outcomes if it recognizes the connected nature of human, animal, and environmental health. Okay, and one of the ways of doing this is through an integrated One Health surveillance program. This is especially true, of course, for zoonotic diseases. So what it aims to do is have a targeted monitoring strategy, okay, which is called One Health Surveillance, where you will sample various reservoir populations for the disease or the pathogen of interest. It could be wildlife, so you're sampling wildlife health, especially for species that are high risk, species such as bats, rodents, primates, all of which have many shared parasites with humans. Okay, and where also there's a close interface between humans and with other species, um, such as livestock that humans also are highly dependent on. Okay, so you could then sample livestock health, and ultimately you want to sample human health. So I'll give an example of this One Health surveillance program. This is from Pune city. All of you know where Pune is, of course. It's in Maharashtra, where we did a One Health rabies surveillance program. I worked with these excellent folks at the Rescue Charitable Trust, which is an animal welfare organization. They run a hospital, and they have an excellent system of reporting. So they developed this app and a helpline, a web line, where if anybody saw an animal in distress on the road, they could either report it using this app or they would call them on the phone. And they had ambulances in different parts of the city. And so they had all the makings of a passive surveillance system in place. Okay. And they have excellent infrastructure in their Pune facility. So they would bring these animals in, they would isolate them. And then when I started working with them, I provided them with test kits. So these are rapid antigen kits, similar to the ones that are also used for COVID nowadays. So these are called lateral flow assays. And so we took, after those animals had died, we took a brain biopsy, and then we also took a saliva sample, and we tested those for rabies. And you can see in both of these, so the one on the top has a very faint line that you can see here. The one on the bottom has a stronger line that you can see here. These indicate a positive sample. Okay, so we started this surveillance program in September 2017. And over the course of 1 year, I want to show you what we found. So each of those red dots or red dogs is a rabies positive case. So the more you seek, the more you'll find. Okay. Until then, until we started doing this passive surveillance program, people had no idea about the extent of rabies in, even in large metropolises like Pune city, which have had vaccination programs and which have had ABC programs running for several years. So overall, over that 1 year, the program is still ongoing, and we've continued to test several hundred more animals. But in that 1 year, we tested 318 suspected cases that were brought into the hospital, and of which 167 canine cases were detected, rabies cases were detected, 3 bovine cases were detected. Over 140 were the typical furious cases that we saw. Because remember, a lot of the other animals that do have rabies and may not show typical symptoms or may show dumb form of rabies might not even be reported. They might just quietly die on the road somewhere. So this is still a massive underestimate of the total number of cases. Worryingly, 32 people were bitten by known rabid animals. And because they were able to all get treatment in time, they were able to get post-exposure prophylaxis, because they also are in a city like Pune. They had access to biologicals, they had access to the vaccines. There have thankfully been 0 human cases from within Pune city thus far. Okay. So we did a look. We've been doing some analysis with these data, and we found that the hotspots. There are some hotspots of rabies cases in space. So clearly, there are some areas that have more rabies cases than others. So we can know then to target these areas for interventions, but not in time, which means that it's not as if one case is following another case rapidly. It means there are jumps in different places in the emergence of these cases across the city. Okay, so we were interested to know why are these patterns emerging. Okay, so as you know, dogs are the main reservoir of rabies. We started studying the dogs. Now this is in a rural area adjoining in Baramati Taluk in Pune district. So I've had a study ongoing there now for the last 5 years. And what we did is we caught dogs there and we put GPS collars on them, okay? And we started tracking their movements to try and characterize the movement behavior of these dogs, to understand what would cause or what would result in these patterns of emergence of this disease, okay? So this is what we found. So these are individual dogs that you can see. This is just a subset of all the dogs, okay? So we caught dogs both in the village as well as in the farm, okay? And you can see here the farm dogs. So this is the village right here, and all the other animals on the outskirts are farm dogs. And you will notice something, and I'll zoom in for that, okay? I'm going to zoom into the village, and you can see that, and look at the scale here, yeah? So you can see that the village dogs very rarely ever leave the village area, okay? But the farm dogs, on the other hand, travel over much longer distances and have much larger home ranges. So they clearly, their daily movement rates are higher, and their home ranges are also larger, which is what we can see from these graphs very clearly, okay? Now, dogs are not the only species on this landscape that can potentially have rabies. There's an entire ecosystem here. There's various other species that are seen here as well. There's jackals, there's foxes, jungle cats, okay? And all of these also occur close to human habitation. And all of these species, especially jackals and sometimes even wolves, have been known to become rabid and attack humans. Okay, so we did the same thing. We caught them, we put GPS collars on them, and we started following them around. So these are typical movement patterns of foxes on the left, of jackals on the right. Okay. So you can see them going about doing their thing. And this is also interesting. You'll see is a mixed landscape. So there's grasslands here, there's agriculture, there's human habitation, and some of these species are not averse to going into human habitation. So for example, this jungle cat, the one on the left is a typical jungle cat found in sugarcane fields, these 3 individuals, okay? The one on the right was caught outside Baramati town, okay? And you can see goes right into the city itself. It's walking on the streets. So it's more of an urban jungle cat. Okay, you'll see it here. It's, you know, happily walking down the streets. Most people, if they saw this at night, would just mistake it for a normal house cat. Okay. So now when we start putting all of these data together, I'll show you what it looks like when I put dogs and jackals together. Okay. So this is just to show you potential for interaction between these species. And that happened very quickly, so I'll play that again. Okay. What you can see in red here is the jackal. The blue dots are dogs. Okay. And in the course of their normal movement, there is a potential for overlap and interaction between these species. Now, if we take, this is just for a few hours, but if we, or a 24-hour period, but if we now overlap all of these home ranges on top of each other, okay, you can see that the dogs in black and these other wild animals overlap quite a bit in space. And this is what a 3D map of that overlap looks like, okay? Now, you know, so what do we do with all of this information? You see, the world has a target, has an ambitious target of reducing rabies to 0 by 2030, okay? And the way they plan to do it is by aggressive vaccination of free-roaming domestic dogs or of owned dogs. So you have to achieve 70% coverage levels, okay, of all dogs every year. Now that sounds easy to do, but of course it's very difficult because India has a population of about 16 million dogs. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to test an alternate hypothesis. Okay, this is our hypothesis: is that the urban high-density dog population is the source of rabies. Okay, and it spills over from these urban high-density sources to rural areas via some kind of a peri-urban link population, okay? And from time to time, a rabid dog will emerge from this landscape into the rural area where it may or may not interact with the wild carnivore, and the wild carnivores may also then play some part in transmission dynamics.